Well, hello, and welcome. It's your girl, Narissa. TCGT Entertainment here, CEO, lead creative producer, in conjunction with Seedbox Digital. We are here to represent the New England Cellphone Film Festival. Oop, oop. Happy to have you all here today. Today, we are going to talk about women in film. Yes, all of the different happies, joys, all of those wonderful things. We're going to be talking about that here today. We have an amazing panel. Let me tell you, you don't want to miss any of it, so make sure you stay tuned. Right now, I want to take a special shout out moment for Moondog Labs and Celtics. Thank you, our sponsors, as well as Bridge Builder, Cinematic Arts Programming. We really appreciate all of your sponsorship and your in-kind donations towards the festival. We're extremely grateful. Right now, we also want to make sure that we promote our Cellphone Film Festival. The deadline is Sunday night, maybe Monday morning, but Sunday night, so that we can get it in. Everybody come out, be a part of it. The actual festival is going to be October 1st. Tell your friends, tell your mama, tell your granny, let her know. Time to get it in. It's almost there. Can't wait to see you there. Bye.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Caterina Aragon. As if you tuned in last week, I am the educational coordinator for TCGT Entertainment and the person who has been helping with these webinar series throughout the Cellphone Film Festival promotion. So again, I want to thank TCGT Entertainment, the team, and all of our sponsors for allowing us to have this amazing event happening. As Narissa mentioned previously, know that the deadline is coming up soon. If you have a video that you have shot with a cell phone, please submit to this link that you see on the screen right now. I would like to say thank you to everyone who's tuning in. I hope that you all enjoy this conversation with these amazing panelists. However, first and foremost, I would like to address that this conversation about women of color in film will have some topics in regards to sexual assault, abuse that can be physical, mental, verbal, and emotional. And so please take time if you need to step away from this video, completely understandable. But this conversation is important, and we hope that this can help any women of color that are trying to get into the industry. So without further ado, I will be introducing our first panelist. Her name is, sorry, I'm a little nervous because I love her so much. Nyla Wissa, a Boston native. Nyla moved to Los Angeles in 2015 after graduating from Emerson College with a degree in theater education, acting. She currently works at Shonda Rhimes' production company, Shondaland, as social media manager for Shonda Rhimes' personal social media and Shondalands.com social media platform. Thank you so much for being here. I'm sorry, I'm still fangirling over the fact that you're here. Okay. Our next panelist, an amazing person that I was able to share a lot of time in our cultural center at Emerson College. Lissa, I'm so sorry. I just love them so much. Deonarain is a queer, disabled, multiracial documentary filmmaker, producer, artist, and activist from Omaha, Nebraska. Shout out to Nebraska. Her work aims to uplift and bring visibility to marginalized communities and social justice issues everywhere, from racial justice to public education and climate change. She is currently based in New York City and works as a producer and a communications manager for Media Sutra, a POC-owned and employed documentary production and consulting company. Wow, it's been so long.
I know. Hello.
And last but not least, we have the amazing Nadine Martinez. Cinematography is a craft that allows her to explore various worlds while collaborating with people from all walks of life. She's incredibly grateful for the privilege of working beside other artists and storytellers who allow her to bring a new, unique visual approach to every project. This past year, she worked as a PD on a TV show On TV shows like Full Frontal was Samantha Bee and Desus and Mero. I should have asked how to pronounce that. Right.
Yeah.
The Rundown with Robin Thede, and she's worked as an additional camera operator in movies like Netflix's Someone Great and Don't Think Twice. Someone Great was such a good movie. Sorry, I liked it. Anyways, thank you so much for being here, everybody. It's so nice to see all of y'all's amazing faces and, you know, to share the space with you who have the knowledge and mindset and experience that I think a lot of people will benefit from. So, of course, like this conversation is going to be just popcorn, super casual. Yeah, don't filter yourself if you don't want to. So, first question, because I'm sure everyone is curious, and it goes for everyone. How did you get into your career or field or in the industry?
Lissa, go first.
Okay, hello. So I went to Emerson College for Visual and Media Arts, focusing in documentary production and producing. I had always kind of loved documenting things and just picking up the random like mini DV camera we had and filming random things. And then I was like, oh, there's a whole career out of this. And so I went to Emerson and focused on documentary, where I was really able to grow that. Also had the chance to work with the lovely Narissa at TCGT for a little bit. And through my current position, I was able to get through my thesis film, which was a documentary about Indo-Caribbean American identities as an Indo-Caribbean person. And I found the current company through one of the women who I featured in my documentary. She is one of the principals. And so I was really blessed to be able to work with people who share a lot of the same values and are very social justice minded, and work in an all POC company, which is amazing.
So I graduated also from Emerson College in 2015 as a theater education major with a concentration in acting. I moved to Los Angeles maybe like 6 months after and was working at the Emerson satellite campus they have out here, doing kind of like alumni relations. And then I ended up landing a job at BuzzFeed as a video curation fellow, which was pretty much narrating the videos or viral videos that I saw and turning them into articles for BuzzFeed.com. That slowly transitioned into a full-time position as a social media strategist for some of their development partners. So BuzzFeed Unsolved, Try Guys, Ladylike, and really focusing on creating social platforms for them and, you know, creating content for them, getting a lot of behind the scenes footage of videos that they were shooting, and making sure that there was a bridge between them and their audience and their target audiences. I was doing that for about a year. And then Shonda's company reached out to me and was like, we have this really great position. Shonda's looking for somebody to run her personal social media. Would you be interested? And I was just like, yeah. And so then I ended up going to Shondaland, right? I ended up going to Shondaland and really focusing on building her brand on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, making sure that she felt connected with, you know, her followers felt connected with her. And that kind of just slowly transitioned. I'm still doing that, but now I'm also focusing on shondaland.com, our website, and really making sure that we have a following. We're building a bridge between our audience and our, you know, the website team, and also making sure that we get a lot of viewership. A lot of the viewership that we get comes from social media. And so making sure that we're consistently posting and, you know, working with outside brands and development.
I got into it, I guess I always wanted to get into film because I was such a big movie nerd, but I guess it started in 2004. I moved here to New York at that time, and I went to NYU, but I immediately wanted to get on set. And so I ended up going onto Craigslist and just looking for whatever was available. And I worked for copy and credit, as they would say, an offer at the time. And I was a terrible PA, and I got demoted from every position. I was supposed to do lockups first and stop human traffic from like entering the scene, and I was terrible at that. So they had me driving, and I got in a car accident. But they needed me, so they were like, okay, well, just fire watch the truck. So they just had me watch the camera equipment, and basically acted as security, which is ridiculous because I'm so non-threatening. But yeah, so I was on the back of the camera truck guarding it, and so I met the camera crew that was on that particular job, and I just asked, what are you doing? And this guy was loading film into a magazine in a tent. You know, his arms were just, you know, enveloped in this big plastic thing. And he was like, do you want to try? And I was like, yeah, sure. So he let me, he didn't let me do it with like the actual footage, but he had scrap rolls of film and taught me how to do it. And he was like, wow, you learned how to do that really quickly. Do you want to try doing this more, like as a job? And I was like, sure. So he offered to help me, like he had me do another job with him, and I got paid $50 for 12 hours. And I was so thrilled. I was like, I made my first dollar in the business. So that's how I got into it. I mean, I was just so bad at my job. I kind of failed up, I guess, or that's the imposter syndrome voice that I've told, that I've kind of lent my story to.
Yeah, a very common thing, the imposter syndrome. Yeah, that's really, it's so cool to see how every person's journey is really different. Even if, like, you know, we all find film so interesting, and so we find our own paths through it. And so, I mean, I want to know, did you find any hurdles trying to get to the job that you have today as a woman of color, a person of color, before being where you are?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak on that a little bit. Going to Emerson, which is a predominantly white institution, that has also a lot of very wealthy students as well,
Right.
who, or even just people who have come from other cities and coasts. And like me being from Omaha, Nebraska, we didn't have an arts high school. We didn't have like a tech high school. So we didn't have like programs like that in our classes or in our high schools. And so I remember going there, and I was just surrounded by a bunch of white film boys who were like, my dad works for Black Magic, so I've been playing with Black Magic cameras my whole life, so I know what good film is. And I was like, okay. And then we tried to do storytelling, and they didn't know how to construct a good story. They only cared about the visuals. And so that's when I kind of realized, like, okay, this is going to be a bit of a challenge, because there was also a lot of like, it's like the old boys club where you have to know people to get into things. And the film industry is very much like that all around, not just even in college, but like to get hired on sets, you would have to know other people and have connections in all these ways. And so I think I really wouldn't be where I am without Flawless Brown, which is an artist collective that Nyla founded and that I was part of in college, and that Kata is sporting on her shirt, because that was where I was really able to connect for the first time with other women of color filmmakers on set and learn about all the pieces without trying to get hired. And because I wouldn't get hired on set, I didn't have experience, I didn't know people, but then I wouldn't get hired continually because I didn't have experience, but I couldn't get experience because I wasn't hired. And so being on set with a lot of amazing women of color, I got to learn a lot, lots of mistakes, but lots of great things. And that's really where I found my passion for producing, which is also like a very interesting role to go into as a woman of color, because you are kind of seen as like sassy or bossy or whatnot, especially also being a first AD a lot, which is my preferred position a lot of the time. And so just, I think the lack of access to experience is a whole thing that sets a lot of people up for different levels of difficulty. And kind of like Nadine said, she was in like this role and just kind of stumbled upon it, which is how a lot of women of color and other people find their way into it. But I think the biggest hurdle as a woman of color was also not just the lack of access to experience and things like that, but also support and other people to look to in the industry. Especially at film school, and then especially going out into the world. When I had moved to New York, I had been applying, and a lot of people only kind of, and let me backtrack, women of color tend to undersell themselves a lot in terms of the imposter syndrome and in terms of compared to like our white male counterparts who are like, I am a professional cinematographer, and they've been like second AC one time on one like very small college set. And I'm like, okay, have the confidence of a mediocre white man. That's the goal. That you gotta pump yourself up and say that. So I realized I was like underselling myself a lot and my experience. And that's why I think I was thankful to find a smaller company that's allowed to help me grow and is focused really on highlighting marginalized voices and the stories of marginalized people, because my company takes all of that into account and how those factors influence people's lives, as my boss is a filmmaker who worked up the ranks in New York City as well. But I think just a lot of the initial double whammy of being a woman and of color hits you there in like every role, from directing and producing, where you can be seen as like bossy, or to like grip and camera, where it's like, oh, well, are you sure that stuff's not too heavy for you? Are you sure like you can handle all of this? And it's like, yes, I know how to do this. And then also for like screenwriting, even just like silencing the voices of marginalized people, because those aren't the stories that are profitable or that people want to hear, unless it's like, oh, look how far I've come out of this sad place to this amazing place, and kind of like a tokenized story. So I think it's very multifaceted, and even if I don't experience it directly, I know a lot of people and just how the film industry on every level, from like women in Facebook groups that I've talked to and their experiences, to people like Ava DuVernay and Shonda Rhimes, who have also faced similar challenges. So I think there's a lot of challenges, but it shouldn't deter people, because recently, in the last decade, there's been really a resurgence and movement behind supporting women of color as filmmakers and their stories.
Yeah, I also agree. Especially during this time with the pandemic, now that everyone is not able to turn away from social media and the movements that are happening, there seems to be a shift on what audiences are wanting to see. And one of those things that I noticed was a lot of stories by women of color, and especially by POC. So I also agree with you. Anyone else would like to answer the previous question?
Lissa really just nailed it.
I think for me, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's honestly,
we're totally fine. I think for me, so I think when I was at Emerson, you know, I was on stage, I was producing, I was directing, I was writing. And then after graduating, that kind of shifted into more behind the scenes, more corporate. And I think coming from more of a corporate standpoint after graduating, the microaggressions that I faced, and also dealing with the content that I saw that not a lot of people saw, on the internet, and picking and choosing, do I want to fight this battle or do I not want to fight this battle? Making sure not silencing myself, but also understanding that I am a Black woman in corporate America, even though it's in the industry and the industry is supposed to be liberal and inclusive and all of these things. It's still very much white lens, white male led. And so, yeah, it's just interesting to see the similarities, but also the differences that I faced in both roles. So, yeah.
Yeah. Nadine, would you like to?
You mind repeating the question? Sorry.
No, I was asking if throughout your journey to your position that you have right now, if you experienced any, I guess, misogyny or any experiences as those.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. I think Lissa hit the nail on the head. I mean, that experience exactly that you mentioned has happened to me so many times. I'm only 5'4", but I've always been an athlete, so I'm pretty strong. I box, I play soccer. So, lifting cameras, obviously you have to kind of train your muscles, but anybody who's just starting in the industry and, having that physical movement of holding a camera and doing handheld work especially has to train themselves. I mean, it's no different for me than it is for somebody who's 6'2". And, I always kind of used it as an asset, just my physique, especially as whenever I'm camera operating, because you can always build up with the help of grip department. Somebody who's 6'2" can't scrunch down into the tiniest nooks and crannies of spaces, and I always can. So it's always nice to have somebody who's, it's one person. If you're on a 2-camera show, have somebody who's really tall and one who's really short to help accommodate each other. But yeah, I mean, I've definitely run into, a lot of quiet judgment, especially if it's working with new people, as far as just people not realizing, I guess, what position I'm at. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've day played and people will be like, oh, are you a PA? And I'm like, no, I'm a camera operator, or no, I'm the DP. And they'll, be like, oh, I'm so sorry. And it's funny because as a camera assistant, because I climbed up the ranks very traditionally and was a loader and then a second AC and then a first AC and then now operating and DPing. For some reason, I thought that it would get easier with every step of the way, just because I would have, I guess, more connections, a larger network. But it is definitely something I face more frequently, I would say, at this point. And it's kind of, in some ways, it can be discouraging, but as a result, it's led me to have relationships with really amazing people as well, because it's something that I can share with them in connection to their experiences, because obviously it's happening to everyone, and no matter what department. And yeah, it's really made me evaluate my personal values as I go forward in this career, as opposed to just hustling to get any dollar. It's like, who do I want to affiliate myself with? And how can I continue to make this a joyous experience for me? Because, it's a demanding job, and no one wants to go through this and be miserable the whole time, because so many hours are devoted to it. So that's something that I'm just really cognizant of as I go forward, to make sure that I'm avoiding those situations or dealing with them with the tools and the company that help me cope with them.
Right. And has that been possible even during this pandemic, even for all of you? Like, how's your work life right now during this time?
I mean, there's a lot of consulting.
Yeah.
A lot of
it's tough.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess for me, my company, we primarily do short documentaries around the public education system and progressive public education. And so, like, our last project, we were in Cincinnati filming there. So it involves a lot of travel and on-set things. I'm usually the only woman on set, even though we have an all POC team. And I'm also the youngest as a 24-year-old. And so that's also a very interesting dynamic, which has been amazing so far because I love my crew. But we've shifted a lot to more digital things and doing a lot more animations and outsourcing, which it's nice, but it's not the same as like being on set. And so I think that has been really difficult for a lot of people, especially who rely on production specifically. But it's also another way, I think, if you're not in the production mode, the pandemic has been a really good way for people either starting in pre-production or getting their ideas out to gain resources because of the amount of resources that are being like mobilized to support, especially Black filmmakers and Black women, and as well as people who have things ready to go into like distribution or launch, so they can share that more because people are looking for more content to consume all the time, and platforms are highlighting like their like Black Lives Matter sections, and a lot more platforms are being very proactive about that. It's just in the actual production zone that it's been hard, especially since we don't know when all this will be in the clear. But yeah, a lot more consulting, a lot more story building and storytelling, and which also works for me as a communications manager. So I've really gotten to focus more on communications rather than being on set, which has been an adjustment, especially in all of these digital platforms and marketing. So it's been a lot of focus on the pre-production and the distribution, and not so much the actual film making process part of filming.
Yeah, it's also very interesting how production teams are going to start working shortly with all of the new guidelines that are happening. That was the conversation that we had last week about production in during the pandemic, you know, how there's going to be less people being hired and smaller teams, and it's just, we'll see, you know, hoping for the best, but you know how that might affect even like young freelancers who are of color, who are trying to get into the industry, and what that means for already them having to work twice as hard, but now they have to work 4 times as hard. But I think one of the things that I found really interesting about that was saying like you have to have a side hustle. And so being able to be versatile is very important. But speaking on the communications and the digitalization, as you were saying, Lissa, I want to turn to you, Nyla. How's social media been for you during this time and during this pandemic, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement? Seeing so many posts come out, people seeking accountability from different film industries. You know, I remember being so excited to see people telling like Netflix people to not watch shows that had, you know, white savior tropes in them, and you know, like how has social media changed for you during this time?
Well, lots of wine. I think it's been, for me personally, it's been increasingly overwhelming. I think that, you know, Black people and brown people are dealing with 2 pandemics. You know, there's COVID-19 and then there's racial injustice, but we also need to recognize that Black and brown people are dying at disproportionate rates because of COVID-19, because our healthcare system is a part of a structure that is built on racism and systematic oppression. And so I think while I am really, 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 really happy that people are holding companies and holding, you know, these big time execs and actors and, you know, you name it, accountable, and making sure that consequences happen and, you know, there's action, not just holding people accountable, because you can hold them accountable, but if nothing changes from that, then the person is going to continue doing what they're doing. It makes me happy and it makes me hopeful. And I also think that I want to make sure that the momentum keeps going. You know what I mean? And so I think that but a lot of people have a tendency to, kind of get on this train. And as it's going, you know, people are protesting, people are posting, people are calling, people are creating petitions, which is great. But what happens when media, which really is the driving force for these revolutions that are happening, what happens when they pull back? you know, and it's making sure that as a people, we keep up that momentum, because in order, you know, once they go silent and we go silent, change doesn't happen and it's ineffective. And so I think for me, I've had to kind of have a balance of, you know, at the end of the day, I'm always going to fight for Black people. I'm always going to fight for brown people. That comes first. And I've made it a point in my job to make sure, you know, since we have this platform, since I'm running Shonda's social media, making it a point to make sure that we're still posting about these things, to make sure that we're still being inclusive in the conversation, because if your activism isn't intersectional, then it's not activism at all. And so making sure that we're highlighting, you know, George Floyd, but also making sure that we're also talking about Breonna Taylor, and then also making sure that we're talking about the Black trans women who are being killed and being harassed and being assaulted, and making sure it's all equal, but also being able to say, okay, you know, waking up as a Black woman, that's a political statement in itself. And it's okay to take a step back and be like, I'm going to practice some self-care, because it can be overwhelming. It can be a lot. And I think with the pandemic, you know, people don't, I mean, I hate to say it, but white people and people who come from a privileged place they don't really have the choice now to say, actually, I'm not going to pay attention to this. You know what I mean? As we come up on the presidential election and we have somebody who's in office whose rhetoric is extremely violent towards everybody except for white supremacists and white people, white upper class people, we don't have a choice. Like, we just don't. And so if you're sitting at home, which I hope you're doing, I hope you're continuing to pay attention. I hope you're continuing to have conversations and difficult conversations with your peers and reading books and getting enlightened and gaining knowledge, because this is not, you know, Black Lives Matter and the fight for equality is not a week-long thing just because you see it on your newsfeed. The minute that your newsfeed goes back to normal is the minute that you need to continue pushing the conversation. And so it's been hard, but I also know that this is what I'm passionate about. This is where my drive comes from. And I think as a Black woman, as a human being who practices human decency and has beliefs and ideologies that are rooted in equality, it is my duty as I walk this earth to continue having these conversations and to continue making sure that people know about these issues. So hopefully that answered your question.
Absolutely. And more, of course, as always, because it's the reality that we live in. And when everything was going down at the beginning of the pandemic, I think one of the things that I was really interested in, I brought up with Narissa and the TCGT team, is looking at how now these movements we can't turn away, and how they are progressing and also at the same time exhausting a lot of people. And I got really curious because I remember, and let's go back a little bit. I remember when the Me Too movement started, at least actually a little bit behind that, Oscar's So White. I was really interested in seeing a lot of people on social media tweeting about the whiteness of Hollywood and, you know, all of the people that are nominated. And to this day, we still see as you were mentioning, like, people lacking the intersectionality in just the Black Lives Matter movement, where during the Emmys, no one from Pose was nominated for an Emmy. And I love that show, and I think it highlights the powerfulness of the trans community during the AIDS epidemic. And so to go back to those movements like Oscar So White and even the Me Too movement, it seems as though there was lack of highlighting of people of color, especially women of color.
I mean, if we're talking about the Me Too movement, I mean, I think, for clarification, for people who don't know who are watching this, the Me Too movement started way before the Me Too movement actually started by Tarana Burke. And so I think that's where people messed up. You know what I mean? Is when it gained momentum again on social media, because Twitter is now like a huge thing. Instagram is now a huge thing. nobody recognized the fact that this movement started from a Black woman. And I think even with Black Lives Matter, do we recognize enough that this movement started from 2 queer Black women? And so, yeah, I mean, to reiterate, when we talk about activism and when we talk about these movements that happen on social media and these hashtags that happen on social media, we also need to make sure that we're doing our due diligence to honor and to recognize the people who start these movements, whether it's a decade ago or yesterday. And so I think I find it extremely difficult, to be quite honest, not to support, but I guess to support movements that don't really recognize who starts them. And it's about, you know, the honesty behind it and making sure that, yes, you're sharing your story for yourself and for your own empowerment and for your own freedom, but you're also creating a community for people to build them up, to encourage them to share their stories. But you can't do that honestly if you're not recognizing the people who start these movements, you know? And so I think that's something that we need to work on. That's something that I would like to see more on social media, is as we continue these conversations, making sure that we're recognizing people. It's important.
Yeah, and it happens in every single movement, even the Pride movement as well. You know, started out by Black trans women in New York, and sometimes a lot of people forget about that it was a riot.
Yeah.
And the story repeats itself again and again, which is kind of it's sad to see.
It's interesting as someone who is multiracial and holds being a Black woman as part of my identity alongside other pieces of my identity, because it kind of, I can like fly under the radar sometimes as in like other POC spaces also, where even from within movement spaces, there's just a lot of trying to co-opt Black women's stories and not giving them their due credit in a lot of ways. And kind of touching on also what Nyla mentioned about the social media things is we have to keep posting things so people gain awareness, and people want the resources, people want transparency because there is so much access to information now. And it goes far past, there is the point where it's like, okay, it's on, if it's not on your feed anymore, you got to tap in again. But it's also not just for companies to be like, well, we posted something and we're not going to be talking any further about it. Like we said, Black Lives Matter, but we're not going to be, we're going to turn off comments, or we are not going to know how to appropriately respond and bring up these conversations and handle these difficult conversations because we don't have any women of color on our team who are running the social media or anything like that. And so I think that's also where it's like a double-edged sword, where it's like you have a woman of color running social media and doing media making of all these sorts and bringing up these issues, but it's also that extra emotional labor as well to be like, well, I have to do it because nobody else is going to do it. And like, who else is going to tell our stories if I don't tell them? And just continually not seeing what we put out be reciprocated by allies in terms of like, hey, we're doing this because it's important and hopefully you'll be able to learn from it so that you can also take this into your realms that we don't have access to and bring this further and everyone can be informed. So it's a very interesting and complicated place, especially with our political situation and all these Twitter fingers and people acting up on the internet because it's anonymous. And I think, yeah, you have to know your roots. You have to know where it started. And you have, even the intersectionality comes from Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black woman who, when the term wasn't used prior, it was used in different ways by like MLK prior to her redefining and repopularizing the term in a more meaningful way that we use today. So it's just a lot of, you just have to know and acknowledge where everything comes from and give credit where it's due so you can learn and build and continue to expand to include other identities and other possibilities for creating a path to change.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it any better. I wanted to ask, you mentioned allyship, and just out of curiosity, for I guess all of you, what does allyship look like in like a production setting when it comes to being a woman of color by POC? Um, is there any allyship during a production setting, or is everyone just like they see something happen that is a microaggression and they're just like, you know?
I mean, I feel like, allyship can manifest itself in so many different ways. I mean, on the most basic level, it's just treating me the way that you would anybody else, like not asking me to do something differently just because of what I look like or how big or small I am, or just, yeah, just being a professional like you would to anybody else. But I guess on a more serious level, because some things happen at work and on set sometimes that aren't okay, just having somebody see it and witness it and just say, hey, do you need anything, is huge. Because I can't tell you how many times people will see something. And I've been guilty of this too in my younger years, just because it was just what everybody else was doing. And I started when I was like 18, 19. So I was just like, oh, I guess this is normal behavior. And obviously that's wrong. But, just things like I remember when I was younger, there was like some guy in lighting, I was day playing in something, and, he like smacked a girl's ass, and it was just like, yo, like, what are you doing? And just somebody going up to her and being like, yo, do you want me to report this, and check in with her just to make sure that she was okay is huge, and that allyship can come from anyone, just recognizing bad behavior and calling it out and checking up on a person's emotional well-being, for me has been, that for me is a strong sense of allyship. And in addition to that, obviously just making an effort at least to make your sets diverse. There's so many people that are like, oh, but there aren't that many, Black women in lighting. And it's like, well, how do we change this then?
You sure there aren't many, or are you not hiring?
Right, exactly. It just feels kind of like the easy answer because, production has a tendency to just want the shortcut because it's cheaper and easier. So I feel like a lot of the issues that we're butting up against, at least as a culture and within Hollywood, runs directly against the desires of what so many producers want and why they only pay it lip service as opposed to actually doing anything about it.
Right. Thank you for that, Nadine.
Yeah, I guess I can talk in a documentary sense as well, as everything Nadine said is things I've either heard of or witnessed. And I think just that offering of saying to the person, like, yeah, I saw that. Like, do you want help? Do you want me to help you do something about it? Or do you want to talk? Like, do you need anything? And I think as someone who is worked a lot as a first AD and like ran a lot of sets, stating as like ground rules when we go on our first day of production and we have our meetings before we start shooting, I'll always say, like, no kind of discrimination is allowed on my set and you will be kicked off set immediately. Like, if this is reported, like racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, anything, like, use people's proper pronouns that they tell you their pronouns are. If you have any issues with someone, come to me and I will help deal with it. I'll either address it myself, provide support to you, or take this to another person. And like, I don't want to hear any of that. Like, that's not what this is about. And so I think also just standardizing, having that support and just having that be like, because a lot of productions don't do that. They don't even state like, oh, like, you will face consequences for being discriminatory towards people, including like snide comments and all of those things, and especially around like sexual assault or making comments about people's like bodies or abilities and all of those things, using inappropriate language. And I think for me in documentary, what I appreciate is I've been brought into this process that my team calls transformative storytelling, where we really make sure in the pre-production process and in every step of production, since we do go into a lot of Black and brown communities, and we are people of color ourselves, but we're also working with bigger companies and like national networks and communities we don't belong to. Like in Cincinnati, I don't belong to the white Appalachian urban community, but they face a lot of their own things and they have their own way of telling their stories, just as people in Lower Price Hill, Cincinnati, who are Black or brown have their specific community, because I don't understand that because I'm not from there. And so we focus really on the personal, intrapersonal, and external, where you really have to sit and evaluate your personal privileges and connections with the stories you're telling and the communities you're going into, and trusting them that how the story comes to you and how they present their story is the way that it's going to be told, and really prioritizing building those relationships instead of just going in, being extractive, and then heading back out. Because especially in documentary film, there's so much extractive and exploitation and like voyeuristic work where people go in, they're like, oh, nice to meet you. Oh my gosh, thank you for sharing your whole story about all of your trauma and crying on camera. We're never going to speak to you again. So really building those relationships, and like my boss is still in connection with this grandma from the south side of Chicago that he met years ago, and they still chat like monthly. And it's like we build these meaningful connections because they matter and because we know what a difference it makes in not just the process, but in like the purpose, as well as you have to see how your films and what you're putting out into the world are challenging what's out there, not giving into the stereotypes, not giving into those harmful narratives that a lot of people use, even down to like something as simple. The other day was we were showing a contrast in a social media post, and we had to edit it because we had talked about it, and it was like, we don't want to reinforce the Black is bad narrative, and one side was like darker colors and the other was lighter colors, and we don't want to reinforce that like Black is bad. So down even to that minute impact of how you tell your stories, how you share your content is something that's really important to me, and that has become like an integral part of the process in really making sure that you can be a good ally, and just assessing how you connect in every way, including your internal reflections before stepping on set or stepping out to communicate with people about how to share their stories, how to work with them, and how to best be an ally in the external sense. You have to do the internal work first as well.
Yeah, I think that's very important, because the many times I've heard a lot of film people, especially at our university, try to address race, and it seems very voyeuristic, and they don't. I think that what falls a lot short is the power dynamics between, if a white person were to do that compared to a person of color from a different community coming into a community that is not their own. And so I think that's where it becomes a little tone deaf, because, as you said, I'm going to come in, I want you to share your whole story. I'm going to put it on camera and hopefully not make them seem like a pity party, and then make money out of it. It becomes really, yeah. I saw that a lot, and it's harmful. It is really harmful when people don't do their due diligence to these communities and don't share those communities in a proper way that honors them. Sorry, this is like a lot. I hope the viewers are okay as well, because it's certainly, I think, especially for young women who are trying to get into the industry and are going through this pandemic right now, hopefully staying at home, please wear your masks, viewers, and take hand sanitizer with you if you're going outside. Wash your hands. It's important to find ways to seek that community and be able to stay safe. One I wanted to touch upon really quickly before we get into a commercial break. How do you see colorism play a role in the film industry?
I was hoping that that you would ask this question, because I think that this is a conversation that does not happen enough. Sorry to interrupt you. Finish the question, and then we can go
Honestly,
into it.
I think point blank, just colorism in film, in social media, in just social justice movements, because, and I think it's also, if we can get to at some point even colorism inside the community, especially me as a Latinx woman who is of course white passing, colorism please is so big when I first started looking into Black Lives Matter when I was in high school, and like being in Panama, because I live in Panama, and just seeing how all these people were pushed, like Black people and Black Caribbean people were pushed into small areas and redlined because they were Black. And it's important, and I think it also affects communities like the Latinx community, like the Black community. And so if we could get to a conversation about colorism even inside the community and how that looks like, fine by me. It's a big topic.
Yeah.
So
we can get into the nitty-gritty. Yeah, I think, just recently, I mean, colorism has always been a conversation within like my home and within my friend group. I think recently I've seen it a lot more on social media, just with Black Lives Matter and everything that's going on right now. And so within the industry, it's always been the lighter, the better. And that's historically, not even within the industry, just in general, the lighter, the better. And so I think, specifically within the Black community, lighter skinned Black people need to do a better job at recognizing our privilege and understanding that, yes, we have more privilege than darker skinned Black people. It's something that we need to recognize. It's something that we need to address. It's something that we need to dismantle. And it also doesn't take away from our Black experience. And so I think, just like going on Twitter and seeing like the threads and the tweets and all that, I have seen, it's almost like when you tell a white person, like a white woman, your experience, and they're like, the fragility pops out, and it's like, oh, they start like crying and getting like sensitive and upset. It's not about you. It's not about you. It's about that person's experience. Just because one of my darker skin homegirls is telling me about her experience doesn't mean that she's saying to me, because you're light, takes away from your Black experience. That's not what it's about. And until light-skinned Black people can have, and I'm only saying this because I'm speaking from my perspective, I think until we can have these honest conversations about colorism within our community, we have to be honest with the fact that, yes, systemic change in general can happen, but it starts from like within our circles. And we can't expect for white people and non-Black people to be allies and not have it be performative if we're not really, really actually being allies to our Black brothers and sisters. And so I have seen, examples of, lighter skin actresses. People will like tag them in tweets and be like, oh, like, I want you to play this role. Like whether it's like Princess Tiana from Princess and the Frog. And the actress is like, no, this role is meant for a dark skinned Black girl. That's not how this works. And we can't expect, like, this conversation isn't for fragile people. You know what I mean? It's also not an attack on us, but it needs to happen, and there needs to be systemic change within our own communities in order to see systemic change within the outside communities. But I'm really happy that you brought it up. I'm just so happy that you did, because I was like, we have to talk about it. If we're going to talk about race, if we're going to talk about the industry, if we're going to talk about, being women of color, we also need to talk about the ways that we can be better and the ways that we need to do better within our own communities. So.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said.
Yeah, I think to add to that, completely agree with everything Nyla said. And as I mentioned, I'm like finding my balance in my identity, especially within how colorism works, has been a very interesting process, because I'm literally part of so many communities. I'm Black, Indian, Chinese, Portuguese, all these things, very mixed Afro-Indo-Caribbean. And so my grandma, a very light-skinned Black woman, and then my dad is a darker-skinned mixed person, and I have a white mother, and all these crazy things. So finding out how to fit in not only within my identity, but also recognizing, like, I love being Black. I love being part of that, and it's just so beautiful. But I will never know the struggles with how racially ambiguous I am, of even Nyla, who is a lighter-skinned Black woman who, when she's like, people always don't like look at me and say, like, oh yeah, you're Black. So I will never know what it's like to be only seen as that in many spaces, not even close to understanding dark-skinned Black women, dark-skinned Asian women, especially like within the South Asian community, within the Caribbean too, and all the colorism that happens there. I mean, within the South Asian community alone, it's a whole giant thing, with Fair and Lovely and all of these things happening. And I think, like Nyla said, we can't have these conversations about race without talking about colorism, and without talking about how much that impacts everything. And even, like you said, with casting actresses, I remember the whole thing about, I don't know, was it Zoe Kravitz and her
Anna.
and the nose prosthetic? Yeah.
I mean, there's another example with the actress from The Hate U Give. The book actually has a dark-skinned woman or young girl, and the actress, I don't remember.
Amanda,
yeah.
Still a lighter skin tone, and that was also an issue when that came out as well. So even the actors that are being casted tend to be of lighter skin.
And then roles that are like the infamous Precious with Gabri Sidibe, being a like large, darker skinned Black woman, Uzo Aduba playing Crazy Eyes and being cast as that, and like just the way all this casting works, is just such, it plays into the stereotypes, and it plays into another whole level of discrimination, because there really is no reason for it to be happening other than that it's a historical structure that we have to also dismantle within our own communities. And I think on top of that, for like non-Black POC, talking about colorism in your own, like in our own communities, but then also having the anti-Blackness discussion with that and linking them is like inherent, because we can talk, South Asians can talk all we want about colorism and the caste system, but then we also have to talk about, especially in the Caribbean, the anti-Blackness on top of that. As someone who's Guyanese, there's many racial tensions there, but even like the discrimination of darker skinned Indian people in Guyana is not even equivalent to being a Black person in Guyana. Like, they're completely separated, and there's a whole additional level of that. So I think it is a very important conversation to have. And especially, like Nyla said, it doesn't discount your identity. Like, being light-skinned doesn't discount that all the pieces that make up you still make up you, or being white passing or anything. It's just being able to also recognize, like, it's uncomfortable, but we got privilege. Like, there is privilege in it, and we can use that to take it to like other spaces and highlight people whose voices need to be heard and help in that. But we have to also recognize in our own selves that yes, we have privilege. And I think once people get over, like, not get over it, but deal with the acknowledgement that, like, oh yeah, like, I am light skinned, that affects how I move in this world and within racialized spaces, doesn't discount my identity, but it is something that is important and like can't be ignored in conversations. And I think that's something that really needs to come to the forefront more, especially in movement spaces, in media, in representation. It's not just about racial representation, gender representation. It's about how people can see themselves, which is why I think, especially like Moonlight, for example, had such powerful representation in so many ways. But yeah, that's just one example I can think of work that's being done really well in the film industry, and all the intentionality behind it, in like from the lighting to how it was directed and the story. Just there was so much intentionality in it to really uplift people who aren't seen as often in film.
And going off of Lissa's point, like, with, Uzo, and with, making sure that it's also about like when we do put dark-skinned women and dark-skinned men into these to lead roles, it's normalizing and humanizing them and not putting them into these roles where they're like these characters, like with crazy eyes. Yes, and also no. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think about like Viola Davis and How to Get Away with Murder.
I was gonna say, yeah.
And normalized, homegirl's taking off her wig before she has sex. She's out here dealing, with alcoholism. We're normalizing this, and she's a woman, but she's a dark-skinned woman, and I think it's just making sure that if we're gonna put dark-skinned people in lead roles, we're not making them characters and perpetuating this stereotype of Black and brown and of dark-skinned people that they have dealt with for years and years and years. And that's also where the work comes into play too. It's not just giving them these lead roles, but it's making sure that we're giving them roles that normalize and humanize them.
Yeah, I think that has a ripple effect too. Just having a young person who is darker, who has a dark complexion, just sees the possibilities of what they can do. It has a waterfall effect for following generations that I think, people who just pay lip service don't realize what grand effect can actually have. Lissa, you mentioned this, with colorism, it really does stem into every community globally. It's almost like a colonialism mentality. I've been to, my family's Filipino, and I visited them a few times over there, and, I'll watch the local media and their entertainment. And I was like, why is everybody so light on TV? It's crazy, because when you walk out the door, nobody looks like that. And it's really strange to see that in other countries. It's really far reaching. And, because so many people look to Hollywood entertainment as of now, it's obviously expanding, and media from all over the world is being made and shared at such a high rate now. And there's such cool stuff coming from South America and Asia and Africa. But, US movies and cinema has set an example. And, in order to continue to do so, I feel like it's essential for Hollywood to change in order to keep up with the fact that most of the world is brown. Most of the world is Black and brown. They have to deal with that. But yeah, that's just my 2 cents.
Agreed. Before we continue this amazing conversation, I'm going to say that we're going to take a 5-minute commercial break. So, viewers, if you need to get some water or go to the bathroom, please do. However, I do recommend that you stay and wait for this exceptionally amazing video that was given to us by, or as a gift to us by Hollis Meminger, who is a well-known cinematographer. He's the one of the people that works for Bridge Builder Cinematic Arts, a program that helps young people of color to get into the film industry. And this is his Juneteenth video celebration. So please stay tuned to watch that, and we will be back to continue this conversation.
Free as a bird with his eye on a glance. It just don't look bad. It don't look bad. Don't look bad. It don't look bad. You can see I'm lost. Thrown it all down. It's been a long ride, fighting through the crowd. Free as a bird with his eye on a glare. It just don't look bad. It don't look bad. Time's not so long now. Fly while you can. Don't let the strong wind keep you from your land. Don't look back. Don't look back. Don't look back. Don't look back.
You made it before the deadline, August 23rd, for the New England Cellphone Film Festival, presented by That Child Got Talent, Entertainment, and Seedbox Digital. This is a unique opportunity for filmmakers ages 15 to 24 to submit short films made on their cell phones. The New England Cellphone Film Festival is an opportunity for those young people passionate about film to submit either a narrative, a documentary, or a music dance video. You can fall also into 3 different categories: feature, which is 10 to 15 minutes long, short, which is 5 to 7 minutes long, and rapid fire, our specialty, for 1 minute and under.
And And we're back. Thank you so much again for staying with us for this conversation about women in film in the industry. So we were touching upon the conversation of colorism, and I think one of the important things to point out when we're talking about colorism in the community as well is highlighting how colorism is a form of seeking whiteness in our community, because history has told us to seek whiteness in order to have privilege, in order to have resources, in order to be accepted into society. I wanted to turn to more of a production team aspect and ask, how does colorism play a role when hiring for like PA or DP positions, or even just like production teams, if that happens in a production aspect? If it doesn't, then that's amazing, and it's also fine.
I feel it must, because I mean, I don't know. I just feel like people's biases are so deeply entrenched, but I can't speak to it personally or in detail, I guess, because I mean, all of this stuff is food for thought that I've been really chewing on for the past only few months, really, because I've had the time and all the things are happening right now, and this has been a really great time of educating myself. So I'm still analyzing, how could this have happened in the past? But more importantly, how do I make it sure that this is not the case in the future, and being a part of that solution? So as far as previous experience, I can't speak to it exactly in this moment. But I don't know. I feel like it must play in somehow, though.
Yeah, I feel like I also can't speak as much to it as someone who is a relatively very young person in the film industry, as a 24-year-old, only graduating in 2018, only have been in New York for about a year, and now I'm working full-time with an amazing company that really does prioritize people of color. And just from working on film sets in college, I mean, there weren't that many people of color to begin with, so there was only a handful to choose from. But I think it also comes back to the question of when we can apply the same lens of racism and misogynoir and misogyny to how we assess bringing on people to our sets and like addressing that. I think Nadine had mentioned earlier, like, why aren't there more like female grips? And it's not just because they don't exist, but it's like what is in place, not providing people the tools, and what systems are working against people to prevent them from getting experience in these roles, getting training in these roles, visioning themselves in these roles. And film inherently in the US, at least, is a very white space. And I think a lot of especially in documentary, which I can speak to more specifically, a lot of the grants and things that empower people come from other BIPOC companies, like Firelight Media and like with Shonda Rhimes and all of these people who have worked up into these places looking out for other people, but you really don't see colorism being addressed in that same way in the situations. And I think it goes back to representation, where it's really important to see that and prioritize voices. And I'm really lucky to work with two amazing cameramen on my team who have inspired me and have gained, they've been in the industry for a while, and just hearing about their experiences, we haven't breached on the point of colorism directly, but it's been amazing to work under them and learn new ways to navigate and kind of disrupt that narrative of like colorism in crew spaces, because it exists. And I think we really only tackle things, especially in front of the camera, because that's what's visible. We don't often make it as much of a point to talk about the crew and behind the scenes and all of those things, and replicating what I see, especially with like PAs and people who are lower on the totem pole, is it always gives me that uneasy feeling when it's like lighter skinned people directing and producing and then having darker skinned PAs. And it's kind of like, I'm just like, house slave feels slave, like what's going on? Like this makes me uncomfortable. Like it just throws me back into that whole mentality of not seeing people be able, like darker skinned people being higher up on set and prioritizing that mostly in front of the camera instead of also on the crew. But I can't speak to it personally or directly, but it definitely exists. And I think it's an important conversation that I would love to hear people genuinely share their stories about from the production crew aspect, since I have not experienced that directly, because I think it's an important conversation to have.
I think part of the reason why that conversation hasn't been happening on sets in production is because they're just opening to their eyes that like racism exists. It's like, yeah, dude. You know, like, so colorism is just like, that's like AP bio to them. They're just like, what? You know, so I feel like, you know, change happens, you know, really over the course of time, over generations. So the fact that this conversation is happening is a sign of progress. I think it's just going to take a little bit of digestion for, you know, especially for white folks to be included in the conversation, because, you know, they are still just grappling with the fact that racism exists, or not they in general, but a lot of them, at least the ones that are in my circle.
Yeah, I think it's also important because I feel most of the time whenever I see, you know, award shows, and as you said before, Lissa, like what you get to see is what is put on camera. You don't get to see the crew aspect of the film industry. And even just those who get awarded are only just a small group of people compared to all of the others that you see in the credits, and people don't stay to see the credits. And so how are people going to know, for example, especially during this program that Nadine and I are part of, the Bridge Builders, we're teaching, or there are instructors there that are teaching these young people, majority of them are people of color, about the film industry, and how can they know that they could like be a costume designer, or even like someone who does color correcting. So all of these like small aspects of crew are kind of invisible to us, and how even there can be like power dynamics in between those roles as well, because maybe, you know, men of color are hired for those positions more than like women of color are, and maybe women of color tend to be the ones that do the costume or makeup and all those things, you know. So I also agree that there needs to be more conversation, just so that people are aware not only of what potential there is in the crew, but also like what is the culture there, because the film industry has such a harsh culture of hierarchy. And so I also wonder if there's ever a possibility for that hierarchy to go away, to make room for women of color or young like people of color to get hired at a same rate as, you know, the white counterparts.
And I think just touching on that really quickly, it brought up something in production also. It's about the small things. Like if we're increasing representation on camera, we also have to have that knowledge behind the camera. We have to have grip and electric who know how to light for darker skin and not make people look ashy, or how to balance having a lighter skinned person and a darker skinned person in the same scene, because that takes technique and skill and knowledge that people don't even think about. Or not having people blend into the background, or settings on like camera profiles, and like which settings might be best for like darker skin, or shooting in like especially darker skin in low light, and how to balance all of that. Makeup artists, hair, wardrobe, like all of this goes into how the people who we see on camera, how they're represented. Because if you have someone who doesn't know how to like dark skin, doesn't know how to do like 4C hair, someone who doesn't know how to do makeup for a darker skinned person, and someone who is just like not paying attention as much to the little tweaks they can make and really understanding their camera to make it work for every person, it's not gonna, no matter how much representation you have, it's not gonna look good, and it's gonna be, one, embarrassing for your production, but two, like, it's just things that all people should be aware of, and they're not. And I think it really only people start thinking about it once it becomes an issue, whereas people who live it every day know how to expect things like this. Like, people of color have to learn how to do makeup for white people if they're makeup artists. They have to know how to do white hair. They have to do all these things. So why isn't it standardized to have it also be the other way around?
Yep. Yeah, that's also very true. There are a lot of things that even I think film school does not teach you about these things. So thank you for bringing that up. That's really important, Lissa, especially for the young audience that could be watching us right now. It's important for them to know. I wanted to ask and see, do you feel as though being a woman of color and like however you identify as, when you're on set or when you are working in your career, do you feel as though there's a sense of you being like a representative for your for your community, when you have, like, for example, a white male counterpart or like a white female counterpart that works with you, that could give you a, you know, a boost up in your career? You know what I mean? I don't even know why I'm sugarcoating this. Do you have to, you know, like, do you feel as though you have to play a role as a representative when you are surrounded by white people in film or in your workspace?
I don't feel like I have to do anything that a white person tells me to do. Let's be very clear. I don't feel like I have to create, I don't feel like I have to, and I'm very fortunate to feel this way, because not a lot of Black people or brown people do feel this way, which is not on them. But I don't feel like I need to tone myself down or make myself any less than, or make myself smaller to make my white counterparts feel comfortable. That's just not something that I don't think I've ever really done. I do think, you know, it's two different experiences from both jobs. You know, I think, you know, when I was interviewing for Shonda, she was like, "Oh, so why do you want to leave BuzzFeed?" And I was just like, "Do you want me to be honest?" And she said, "Yeah." And I said, "I don't want to work for the white man anymore." And she was like, "Points have been made. Okay." And so it just is like, it's just two different worlds. I do think, you know, Shondaland is definitely a much more smaller company. And so navigating there is a lot different. And, you know, being on the inside, it's a melting pot. There, people come from different age groups, different backgrounds. It's just a different world. Working in a huge multimedia company, though, where it is corporate. It was corporate it was like millennial corporate. We'll call it that, if that's even a thing. But I think a lot of the people who were in higher up positions were white men. And since it was a more progressive, liberal, young company, a lot of the times, it was harder to navigate my Blackness. And I think, like, I experienced that even at Emerson. You know, I came from my high school. I went to Boston Arts Academy. It was an arts high school. The kids that I was raised in Dorchester, Massachusetts. You know, the kids that I surrounded myself with, my friends and my classmates, and we all, if they didn't look like me, they either came from the same neighborhood as me, the same socioeconomic class as me. And so race, to me, I was lucky enough to know what being Black was, you know, to be raised in a home where I was taught about racism and I was taught about all these things, but never really had to address what that meant with another white person because of the people that I surrounded myself with. And so, you know, even going to Emerson, navigating that space of now being the only Black girl in all of my classes and dealing with the microaggressions and dealing with institutionalized racism and oppression, and, you know, being this theater kid and not really seeing parts that were made for me, or, you know, getting parts about, you know, talking about my Blackness, but written by white people, and then graduating and then working at BuzzFeed. I never felt like I didn't feel like I had to shrink myself, or like make myself smaller, but I did feel like there was always just kind of like this fear of like, at the end of the day, I'm a Black woman and I'm always going to vouch for Black and brown people. Always. I'm always going to speak up for them. And also there's this real fear because of institutionalized racism that if you speak up, you come off as sassy and aggressive and all of these things, and you can lose your job, you can be seen as less than, you can get a demotion, you can do all of this. And so it's hard to navigate, you know, it's hard to navigate when you want to be vocal because that's the right thing to do. And it's also not on you to teach people because that's invisible labor. But then it's just, yeah, it was definitely hard to navigate, but I never felt like I needed to shrink myself. But it was tough. It's tough when people who are in higher up positions don't understand what it means to deal with microaggressions and to deal with racism. And yeah, it's tough. It's tough.
Yeah, I think for me, growing up in such Omaha's a very segregated city where I grew up. And so I spent the first half of my life in North Omaha, which is the Black part of town, and then West Omaha is where I went to high school, which is a lot of wealthy white people. And so I hadn't really even considered race. Like, I was used to being the only one, especially as like a mixed Caribbean person in Nebraska. I think we were like probably one of the only Guyanese families there, if any. Like everyone, they all just went there. It was just us. And so then coming to college, I was like, oh my gosh, there's so many people to connect with who are like me, who are creative and like women of color and people of color. And I think I really just embraced that and learned everything I could. And college is where I really started noticing how impactful and like unpacking all of the microaggressions. And I ended up doing a minor in global and post-colonial studies and really focusing on that and making identity and belonging and collective memory part of my documentary work, because I think it's really important things to focus on, and really just embracing my identity as like a multiracial woman of color. But I still think going, like Nyla said, like my first job out of college, besides freelancing for a while, which is already an interesting place to try and get in when you move to New York City and you're trying to freelance as a woman of color fresh out of college, because it's a lot of group chats and Facebook groups and knowing people and being like, oh, well, I have an ongoing PA gig, but I can't make it this weekend. Can you go instead? And then it's just like you're switching sets all the time. And so you never are able, like you can build connections, but you're never consistently always under or working with the same people. So it's hard to feel able to address the situations that happen to you because you're on different productions all the time. And while you run into similar crew members and people, it's like you're just there to be the PA for the weekend or for the week, and then you're hunting for your next job. And my first job out of college, besides freelancing, was at a boutique post-production ad agency. And I was a post-production coordinator. And I think a lot of things went into that, about not only having it be like my first job at like an established company other than freelancing, which living in New York's expensive, so that was a major stress, was securing that job. But then also like imposter syndrome, being a woman, being young, being one of the few like women of color in more of like a coordinator role, on top of balancing other identities, because there were a lot of like queer people who worked there, and I could relate on that front. But it was a very interesting thing, because like they had considered themselves a minority-owned business, but it was queer white people, and I was like, this is interesting to me and my identity. And so I think in that position, I let my anxiety get the best of me about trying to perform and about trying to like please people and trying to fit in and trying to like mask myself into this little acceptable box. Whereas now, working for a POC-led company, POC employed, which encourages me to be active in social movements. We're active in multiple like social justice movements and great things like that, where I'm encouraged to fully embrace and like stand up and just kind of like break down all these structures. I'm really grateful for that, because it has completely shifted the tone of how I approach filmmaking and showing up in filmmaking spaces. And even just like, I think the thing that's been most helpful for me in getting into this industry is joining so many supportive like women of color spaces online, like Facebook groups like Brown Girls Doc Mafia and like Women of Color in Filmmaking, and all these spaces where you can go and post your questions, you can talk to other people who have experience and kind of gain a connection through that way, to be like, yeah, like this has happened to me, or like it shouldn't be like this, here's how I handled this, or like you're not in the wrong. All of these things that have provided support when like you might not necessarily be able to have it tangibly when you're on sets and you're switching sets so frequently. But as I've grown over the years, I've learned to be more unapologetic in how I show up, and being, I always say, like, I am not half this, half that. I am not like a woman and a person of color. I am like a woman of color. It's a whole identity. It is an inclusive identity of everything. Like, I'm not just like pieces you can pick apart. And I think really taking the time to understand myself in that, and also just like dive into that world of exploring things and learning more, was able to get me to where I am today, in terms of being able to be like, you know what, these are systems and structure that place, or like this is a microaggression, or I should say something about this. So I think I'm slowly, and it's an ongoing process. It's a lifelong process, dealing with identity and race and gender and everything. So little steps at a time, even for yourself personally, because you can't just focus on working on making change externally. You have to work on making it internally as well. And like, you can say like, oh yeah, like I'm a great filmmaker, but like you have to actually believe that and really work on having that confidence internally, so you can take it externally and really make an impact in an even more meaningful way than just fighting for it without doing that.
Yeah, it's exhausting, and I think it's also important to talk about when women of color come upon these situations, how to best take care of themselves during this time, because we can't just keep having this conversation of, what to do as a woman of color in the industry, but what other people can do. As we were talking about with colorism, like if the people in the community don't do their work internally, then there is no progress. But at the same time, and at the same time, we also have to recognize that we have to stop having to put these women of color in situations like this. And even if they reoccur, how to best take care of themselves during those moments, which I think is important to talk about. So I wanted to ask for your advice. If, what would you tell, a woman of color who is in the industry or is trying to, find their way into the industry and is coming across all of these microaggressions and all of this colorism situation? Like what best ways can they take care of themselves if things are too much or it's an emotionally draining process, if that makes sense of a question?
Turn off your social media, or like turn off your phone, or like don't look in your comments section if it's something that you're sharing online. That's a big one. And this is something that I feel like advice that I should follow myself, but really have a mentor, somebody who can help you. I know it's a little bit hard when, there aren't so many people, like a wide swath of women in positions of power, but there's growing amount, and there are people that are certainly trying. A mentor, I always used to think was somebody that was 10 steps ahead of me, but lately I've been reaching out to somebody who's like, who I went to school with, and she's only like a year ahead of me, and she's doing things differently that I look at, and I'm just like, oh, wow, how is she doing that? Where is she drawing her strength from, and it's not always necessarily, like, a mentor doesn't have to be somebody who just has a bunch of skills that you don't have already, because you can learn that. You can go out and take a YouTube tutorial. For me, I'm looking to this particular person because I find that her inner strength, like the thing that makes her her, is what's helping her just ascend, and yes, she's obviously very skilled as well, but for me, the thing I admire most is that I know that she's dealing with some bullshit, and she just seems so strong to me. And I feel like having a mentor like that who is encouraging of you is so valuable. If you can find one, they might be in your friend pool and maybe not even in the same medium. They could be somebody who's a dancer who just deals with the same type of issues, but just have such great inner value and strength. It's always great to have an ally like that, who has experienced similar things or can speak to them.
Mm-hmm.
I think I have various things. I think the first one is, if you don't see it, be it. I'm a firm believer in representation. I think representation is super important. And I also think that each one of us is here for a reason. Not to get like super spiritual or anything like that, but we're all here for a reason. And so I think if you have drive and you know that you have purpose and you know that you're dedicated and you know that you're passionate and you're good at what you do, and even if you're not good at what you do, you can get good, you can get better. Be that, be the representation, be the reason why people are like, oh, I know I can do this because this person did it. I also think one thing that I've had to learn is that people's ignorance is not about me. It's not a reflection of me. It has nothing to do with me. And it's my choice. The choice that I can make is whether I want to engage in it or not, whether I want to have these difficult conversations or not. And so just constantly reminding yourself that that what they're going through and these microaggressions and the fact that this industry still has a lot of work to do, it's not a reflection on who you are as a person. I think the last thing, kind of branching off of having a mentor, is finding pockets of gratitude. I think it's so easy to be hard on ourselves and to say, like, we could do this better, or I could do this better, or I should have done that differently, or I need to do this differently going forward. But what are you grateful for? Be grateful for the fact that you're passionate about what you're doing, because not a lot of people know what they're passionate about. Be grateful for the fact that you have a mentor. Be grateful for the fact that you have a tribe of people who care for you and who believe in you and who uplift you in moments of time that you need it. And so finding those moments of gratitude when you feel like you're being hard on yourself are super important. And also just knowing that, yes, being dedicated to the movement and being dedicated to social change is important. And it's something that everyone should be passionate about and everyone should be practicing. But it's really okay to log off and to disconnect and do what you need to do to restore your peace of mind. Because eventually, if you don't have peace of mind, you're going to give someone a piece of your mind. So just log off if you need to.
Yeah, I think echoing what everyone has said, finding that support group, whether it's family, it's friends, it's other creatives, and I think also a good way to enter, I know I've been talking about Facebook groups, I don't even go on Facebook that much, I don't know, but I see them on my feed. Like, I'm in part of this group called Asian Creative Network, and it's amazing because people are encouraged to share their work, and they'll be like, oh yeah, like I'm starting out as an illustrator, or like I do film, and they share what they do. And it's a place for people of color and people of Asian descent to really be able to share their work and get support, make connections. And I think the other beautiful thing about being a woman of color that I find true for almost every industry or every place that I've been in is that making connections and reaching out to women of color, especially in positions you admire and positions where you want to be, reaching out and even just trying to make that connection of like, hi, I'm a young woman of color who's aspiring to be in a position like yours one day. I would love to chat. I would love to get advice. And more often than not, they're so excited that another woman of color wants to be doing what they're doing and is inspired by them. And so that's another great way, is finding your inspiration, being fearless and reaching out to your inspiration and chatting with them and hearing from them. Because I really think women of color are naturally some of the most caring and loving and amazing people. And especially in creative industries, if like someone reaches out and is like, hey, I love this, like, do you have any advice? I just want to chat. And just building up that way is an amazing way to even get experience. And it's a nice way to connect with other people who have similar experiences versus kind of being also thrown onto a set where you don't know who's there and what to expect. And I think just really finding those inspirations, finding a mentor, people who will support you, people who you have to just like vent or complain to, especially people out of the creative industry or out of the film industry, who you can just be like, let me just tell you about this. And they're not like, oh yeah, I know, but they're just someplace to go where it's outside of the place you're surrounded by all the time. And just building up those support groups and building up your confidence in yourself, because don't undersell yourself. What you make is amazing and it's valuable, and it may not have the top camera or whatever, but there's so many pieces that go into filmmaking and media making that whatever you have to work with is something, and you can still get your story out there. You can still make amazing content. You can still tell amazing stories. And so I think that's some of my advice.
Also, patience. Be patient with yourself.
Patience.
Be patient with yourself.
That's so important. We're in a day and age where everything has to happen now, and
it's a marathon, not a sprint.
It needs to stop.
Yeah. Please.
Wow. That is
and
true.
log
That is
off.
very
We're
true.
on the internet too much.
Somebody once told me slow is fast. I thought that was one of the better pieces of, fortune cookie advice I've ever gotten.
That's a good one.
I think my favorite advice that I just learned recently watching this show was good luck with your life. It's okay. Everyone is living their first life. And that stuck with me because it's like everyone is living their first life. And so we're all trying to figure it out as we go along. And it's important to be patient with yourself and to be kind with yourself, especially in a system that doesn't want you to succeed. And that's really important. I would want to know, what do you hope to see with the momentum going on with the Black Lives Matter movement in, not only just in social media, but also in representation in film and production? And if so, how can, other allies like help with this progression? Like, I think for me, especially going home and talking to a lot of my family members, like who live in, let's say, Nicaragua or in Italy, to address the fact that Black people are alienated in so many spaces and they don't realize it. And it's like they can say things like, I'm not racist, but at the end of the day, if there's a Black person in the supermarket and you just completely ignore them, that is also participating in that racism. And so I hope that in the future, when I am in those spaces with family, which is the hardest part, I think, the hardest people to talk to be able to have those conversations. So kind of that as an example, but what do you hope to see moving on with all of these new hurdles coming in, even with the presidential election happening soon, which, by the way, please register to vote. Anyone who's watching, please register to vote.
And then go vote.
Yeah.
And then vote.
Yes, exactly.
Please vote.
Figure it out.
I think, I think this word diversity, it's become so sanitized and whitewashed, and I think that companies use it now to fill quota. One thing, and also to make themselves look good. Oh, we have Black and brown people, we have LGBTQ people. That means that we're not problematic. That's not how that works. And so I think one thing that I would like to see, as the movement continues, as we get the person who is apparently our president out of office, I can't believe it, but I do hope that these companies and movies, future films, make stories about people who are marginalized, because that's what you're supposed to do. Not because it's what's going to sell, not because, Black Lives Matter is the forefront on all of our feeds, but it's because that's what you're supposed to do. That's what art is. It's creating work for people who are voiceless. And so I hope that, hiring people who are, underrepresented, and I hope that creating films for people who are voiceless and are marginalized and come from marginalized communities becomes normalized. And it's not because because diversity is important. So that's my hope.
Yeah, I think, excuse me, for me, going off that, I really want to see people with resources trusting, believing, and investing in people of color, and especially women of color, to tell the stories they think are important and tell them in a way that they think is important. Because there's no reason that a Marvel movie with an all-white cast should be spending godforsaken amounts of money just to make that happen, when, first off, it already happened. It was a comic book. Second, think about how all of that could be invested in so many independent filmmakers, women of color filmmakers, people who have important stories to tell, people who just need someone to believe in them and help them in ways that people have access to money, people have access to resources and trainings and equipments and all of that, where we can provide that, because it is less about, like Nyla said, diversity and inclusion, and it's more about equity and justice. And having everybody have an equitable start, and like, you just got to believe in us. You got to believe in us and tell people, show the world that women of color and their stories and their skills and their experience and all of everything that has gone into who they are is important, because the world kind of tells us, like, no, it's not important. You're not as important as these billion-dollar movies or directors. Like, sorry. And so I think I just want to see more of that, and more things like this, where you can see not necessarily even like the top of the top people, but people who have made their dreams and their passions a reality, and seeing it on every level of the process. Like, yes, we want to see like A-list celebrities and directors be women of color, but we also want to see everyone in between to show the possibilities that it's not just nothing or it's the top. Like, there's an in-between, and there's ways, there's people in every step of the way. But most of all, I just want people to believe and trust in women of color, to tell their stories and to make their art possible. And for it to be valued and become mainstream and part of the mainstream. Like, I can probably count on one hand the amount of women of color directors I was taught about in film school. Like, literally. And it's just, it blows my mind, because even like at my past job, we were talking about directors, and someone in the year 2019 didn't know who Ava DuVernay was. And I was like, how is that possible? Like, that's what? So just, and like, not limiting women of color and people of color to tell their stories or to follow their dreams. And also just kind of dismantling that idea that, especially in this time where there's a lot of economic and political struggle, that the arts are not a lucrative or good place to invest your energy. Because if it's your passion, it's your passion, and you should follow your passion, and there are ways to make it happen. And so I think that's another thing I want to see dismantled, especially because of the systems and structures, are that there are people of color and women of color in the film industry, and just seeing more of that in authentic, non-stereotypical and non-censored ways, where they're limited by constricting contracts and like NDAs, and like, you're not allowed to say this or talk about this, or we have to do this to appease the white producers. Like, just let us tell our stories, and it will lead you towards like what's important.
Man, y'all's answers were so good. I was like, I can't beat any of that. I guess this might not just be industry related, but I really hope that the coinciding effect of coronavirus, coupled with with everything that's going on activism wise for Black Lives Matter, I really hope that it eventually, I know that people's first reactions were really, just quick response, but I really hope that this results in honest self-reflection, particularly from white people, just in terms of how they contribute to this, and just, what behaviors do they engage in that propagate the system? That's something that I hope really happens as a result of this, which can affect every industry. I just hope that that people are more willing to sit in discomfort, and Asian people as well. This is something that I really grappled with the George Floyd occurrence. There was on Hassan Minaj's shows, which unfortunately was canceled. He did this episode where he zoomed out and showed the whole picture, and it showed that Asian officer, and that really shook me. I was just like, damn, that is super fucked up. And it made me think about just how people in my family, you know, have said things or done things that just, it wasn't necessarily racism, you know, the old fashioned version, you know, of like lynching people and like actual physical acts of violence, but it's still stuff that's just like, you're trying to separate yourself from this other group of people for what? You know, I mean, you're still a minority. You know, dissociating yourself doesn't really give you any advantage. If anything, it just makes me feel uncomfortable and causes a rift in our family. You know, so I really hope that this makes people sit in their discomfort in terms of how they have been surrounded by acts of racism, or even partaken in acts of racism, and how can they amend that? I really hope that occurs as a result of all of this, and that it's an ongoing thing and not just trendy, because this is a marathon, you know.
And this is people's lives that they have to go through this all the time. We are almost out of time for our webinar, but I do have one last question. And I wanted to ask y'all, why do you think it is important, or why do you think TCGT is important to have as like a production company? I think, Lissa, you could speak a little bit on that, as you worked with the company before.
Yeah, I think I just want to express all of my gratitude to TCGT, because Narissa has been a key person in my life for so many years. And as a Black woman leading a production company and doing it unapologetically and not putting up with any of the bullshit and not putting up with anybody's crap from anybody, including myself and the own bullshit I put myself through. She didn't put up with that. She's like, you need to fix this. So having someone who was there for me on all levels, as well as really intentionally prioritizing Black voices and Black stories and the beauty of being Black and the beauty of being a woman of color, and supporting women of color across the board, no matter what their background is just, it was the best thing to have as a mentor. And she's one of the primary reasons, probably the first primary reason I became a producer, and where I am today, because she was like, you don't have to put up with this. And having women of color and Black women leading entertainment businesses and having these conversations and putting these conversations out there is just so powerful, because it's not performative. It comes from the heart, and it really brings everyone together who participates in it and who is part of events and who is part of productions, because it just opens your eyes to so many new things and in so many meaningful ways. And I think TCGT is really innovative, just from everything I've been a part of, is they're constantly pushing things to the next level. And nothing can limit the vision. Narissa is like, and the whole company is like, we will find ways to make this happen, and we will make it happen. And if you doubt me, just watch. You'll be the one laughing then.
Yes,
and so I think that's what
so
I admire most, is just the fearlessness and believing in, like, yeah, this is it. We're going to make it happen. Is just so powerful to see in a company.
I completely agree. If it weren't for Narissa, I don't know if I would be doing this webinar. So, and again, like, such a powerful woman to just learn from and have as a mentor, especially in different aspects of the film industry. I'd like to thank you all for joining me, for putting the time in your schedule to do this. There's so much more to be said, and just the small topics that we talked about when it comes to women of color, and the pandemic and the upcoming elections. And so I hope that in the future we can have more conversations like this. and hopefully bring in other voices. So again, thank you again, our viewers, for tuning into this episode of the discussion series for the New England Cellphone Film Festival, hosted by That Child Got Talent Entertainment. Thank you, Nyla. Thank you, Lissa. Thank you, Nadine, for sharing us your insight, your experience, just your heart and everything. Again, we're making history as time goes by, and it's important to hear what you all have to say and what we all have to say during this time. What am I missing? Thank you to our sponsors again, Moondog Labs, Bridge Builders, and Celtics for supporting us in the New England Cellphone Film Festival. Again, our deadline is August 23rd, so please submit on that link right there at the bottom. And I hope you can all tune into next week's conversation, where we're going to be talking about filming in a budget, because, you know, yeah, young filmmakers are trying to find ways to, oh, that's covering my face. Young filmmakers are trying to make films, but, you know, there's a lot of money that we don't have right now. So how can we make that happen? And hopefully this will help, especially young people of color. So thank you again. I hope you take care. I hope you stay safe. My viewers, please register to vote, go vote, wear a mask, be respectful of other people, 6 feet apart, do your due diligence when researching, and please continue with the movement for Black Lives Matter. This is not something to just have a trend for a week. Please keep doing your work, and please learn more. Please sit yourself in that discomfort. And I hope everyone has a beautiful day. Thank you again, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take
It's not a game, it's a rich thing.